Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Slick Baum. Today, we are going to talk about space-based missile warning and tracking. And I get it, it's not something you think about every day, but trust me, it is really important. To put it bluntly, missile strikes are largely how the enemy is going to attack us, whether it be forward operating bases or the homeland itself. Now, we tend to think about long-range strike in the context of bombers, but our adversaries have invested a lot in missiles. We need to get real about developing modern warning systems to help us track these threats and defend against them if they are ever launched. Parts of this plan are already in play, but a lot needs to be done to hone this effort and align the various pieces. Now, to be clear, missile warning and tracking is not a new mission. We had to develop this technology decades ago in response to the threat posed by Soviet nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those systems and their follow-ons have served our nation well for more than 50 years, and today, the current space-based infrared system, or SBIRS for short, is the most advanced ballistic missile warning capability in the world. However, our adversaries, and by that I'm largely referencing China and Russia again, are changing the rules of the game with the systems that they're fielding. They want to hold our bases and our homeland at risk. They understand how our current defenses work, and they're developing new technologies to exploit gaps. That's the main driver of why they're developing a new generation of hypersonic missiles. And if that wasn't enough, China and Russia are also deploying new anti-satellite weapons, we call those ASATs for short, to hold key parts of our missile warning and tracking enterprise at risk. So you add up a new generation of threats specifically optimized to exacerbate our vulnerabilities, combined with a new set of offensive space capabilities to attack our existing missile warning and tracking enterprise, and you realize it's time for a reset. We need to look at a new set of technologies and strategies to ensure we can still defend our bases and the homeland. Now, obviously, this is a really big deal. So with that, let's cut to the conversation. Christopher Sohn, Senior Fellow for Space Studies at the Mitchell Institute's Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence, has spent the past few months digging into this challenge, not only to just look at the problem, but to investigate where we need to go to deliver solutions. He just released a report on this topic, arguing that the DoD must create a more resilient, survivable, multi-orbit sensor architecture that can track these new threats and cue defenses. All right, well, Chris, I'm really fired up about this paper. Welcome back to the Aerospace Advantage podcast.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Well, you've also done a really good job of getting a great group for this podcast, so we're really fortunate to be joined by some top-notch practitioners in the field. So let's start off with Dr. Davin Swanson. He's the chief engineer with Raytheon Intelligence and Space.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And then we also have, again, on the Aerospace Advantage, Lieutenant Colonel Brandon, Coach Davenport. He's the former commander of the 2nd Space Warning Squadron, and that's the Space Force's SBIRS Squadron. So, Coach, welcome back.
Thanks, Slick. As some folks know, this is definitely a passion area for me. And I'll just highlight, having been on the floor as the Iranians launched those missiles into Iraq back in January 2020, I just have a very visceral reaction to this mission area when it comes to keeping the Joint Force safe. So thank you for having me today.
Yeah, and Coach, you were missed at Patch Night. I just want to give a shout out to especially the Weapons School Class 22 Alpha, the space folks. They were awesome, and I was able to get one of their patches, which is super cool. So I just really appreciate the class and all of the efforts that they're doing, because so much of their mission, as we've talked about on this podcast, is hidden behind the green door of secrecy, and we know that you guys are doing really good work. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And Chris, I want to get started with you. I know we're facing a ton of challenges in the security world right now, so why should we care about this topic?
Well, first, let me just say that this issue that the paper that is published on missile warning and tracking is a now issue. It is not a future issue. The issue is essentially, big picture, is that the United States homeland, as well as our deployed forces overseas, are currently at risk of short-range ballistic missiles, as well as a whole plethora of other types of missile systems, to include some of them being hypersonic and many of the others being low-flying, non-ballistic maneuvering type of missile systems that are designed to counter our current ground-based radars and our space-based sensors that were designed primarily for the Cold War intercontinental ballistic missile and theater ballistic missile systems. And so because of that, as Dav mentioned earlier, the Iraqi strike as an example, as that was, and I believe still is, the largest missile attack on U.S. forces in history. And we're basically in a situation now where missile warfare is now becoming of age. It's becoming heavily proliferated by our adversaries, China and Russia in particular, as well as some of the smaller powers like Iran and North Korea. And so because of that, it is very, very important that we have a space-based missile system that not only can warn of the missiles inbound, but can also track them. And that's one area that we have a huge problem with right now because of these systems flying lower, because they're infrared signature, which is how we usually warn and track from space, are much lower because of the altitude and because of the type of engines it has on it. As a result of that, we have a hard time tracking these from launch to impact. And when you add in maneuverability and hypersonics into the mix, it becomes extremely, extremely challenging. And because of that, this is a problem that has to be dealt with. And so looking forward to the discussion today on both what the report said, but also what the experts in the field here have to say about the topic.
So, Coach, as an operator and as a weapons school graduate, can you talk to us why it's so important to evolve our current missile warning and tracking enterprise? And how is the enemy evolving their technology and strategies, and what does it mean for us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. What we're really looking at is a story that's really old as time, right? You have a capability, one country makes one capability, another country then follows up with a counter capability. And so you've seen aircraft, first gen fighters, second gen, third gen, fourth gen. If you use that same mental concept towards space, you see these systems, the missile warning systems, like the Defense Support Program, which celebrated its 50th anniversary recently, right? That's first gen. It was really good for intercontinental ballistic missiles, but then we recognized it was kind of good for Gulf War 1991 style Scuds. But it drove a requirement for the second generation, the space-based infrared system, which performed very well, again, in that attack against U.S. forces in Iraq, but again, against a ballistic threat. And as the adversaries evolved their capabilities, they're watching our first-gen and second-gen systems operate. They saw the value of having missile. I didn't speak to them, but the missile defense systems also iterate. First-gen Patriot, PAC-3 now, Standard Missile 3, Theater High-Altitude Air Defense THAAD systems. You're seeing these corollary defense systems also iterate in generations. And so they're iterating their capabilities. And so they've recognized that ballistic trajectories aren't going to cut it. They now need to maneuver around and attempt to defeat our tracking systems to increase the lethality of really their primary force rejection capability, right? I think even if you look at Ukraine, the Russian Air Force has not performed well. I'll let the intel analysts come back with the final determination of the Russian missile capability, but what isn't in doubt is the number of weapons they have launched against the Ukrainian population. And so, I think the war today we'll see, and war in the future we'll see a continued use of these systems. And therefore, these newer systems that have, as Chris mentioned, hypersonics or maneuverability or just differences in ballistic trajectories, those drive a new iteration in our system, a third generation, to maintain our edge, to defend, and to provide warning and tracking.
All right. Well, Chris, I know you talked about this in your paper and you mentioned the report, which can be found on our website, but what was your proposed solution?
Well, our proposed solution was that instead of having what we've had before, which is a combination of ground-based radars, such as the phased array radars we have surrounding the continental United States, as well as some theater radar systems like the TIPI-2 that we use with our interceptors and missile defense assets overseas. But because of the curvature of the Earth and because of that being exploited by the lower flying missiles and the higher speed hypersonics, that we really should have a multi-layered, multi-orbit approach to not only have what we have with our SBIRS system, our space-based infrared satellite, which is in a combination GEO and HEO, which means geostationary, geosynchronous Earth orbit, and highly elliptical Earth orbit, which is about 35,000 miles out from the surface of the Earth and has great field of view, so you can see about a third of the Earth with each satellite. So you have constant warning both for theater and for worldwide missile warning, and then have a medium Earth orbit, a sensor to help with tracking, as well as a low Earth orbit, proliferated low Earth orbit, or LEO constellation that is helpful for enhanced tracking as well as what's known as fire control, which allows us to track them real time and plot a intercept solution for missile defense systems. And so with that, plus with some other things we'll mention later, such as being able to actually actively protect these satellites against counter space threats, which is not just a missile problem with this force design, it's also a threat from space thus the need of the Space Force, who operates these vehicles, to have the ability to maneuver and to do other things to actively defend them rather than just relying on sheer numbers. So we'll talk about that more, but that's essentially what the report advocates for.
Well, Chris, thanks for that. And Coach, what are your thoughts on Chris's response?
My personal belief, right, is that is exactly a concept we need to apply. As you heard me speak earlier about that third generational concept, that third generation does need to be multi-layered. It needs to be able to take a punch. It needs to be able to respond to the changing character of war. As General Raymond likes to mention, right, space has always been hard. We've always dealt with gamma rays, space weather, just the physics of orbit. And now we're adding these additional threats that we have to react to that all of our terrestrially based joint warfighters are familiar with, just reacting to the enemy. It's very difficult to retroactively build tactics, techniques, and procedures to respond to adversary capabilities. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. And so if you were to build a new system that is going to continue our advantage for missile warning and tracking, you're also going to need to design a system that's resilient, multi-layered, and can defeat threats, potentially with things like decoys or other types of maneuver capability to ensure that resiliency.
Well, Coach, you're going to be earning your patch pay today. Can you paint a picture for us? And let's say an enemy launches a missile strike. Talk to me about how this new warning and tracking enterprise works from a macro perspective. And can you explain to the audience the difference between warning and tracking? And because as I understand it, they're two totally different tasks that require different capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Chris mentioned that the geosystems really provide great warning, and I always like to bend this. I put two words in front of it's passive warning and active tracking, and that's the passive warning is very much what you saw again in that. I keep going back to it, but it's a good salient talking point. That attack in Iraq, there was no missile defense capabilities embedded at those air bases, and so the warning was purely a passive action to provide for the joint force to take protective action so they would minimize casualties. And warning primarily is focused with the boost phase of a missile. So if you picture, if you've seen Falcon 9's launch or just the Scud YouTube videos, as the rocket lifts off, as the missile lifts off, it's under thrust, and that high energy, all the light you see out of the back, all the fire out of the back allows these systems, these overhead infrared systems, to detect the launch. And so obviously it's time dependent, so the quicker you can get warning out, the more aware that the joint force can be to react to the threat. And so that passive warning is really key to that missile launch, that boost phase of launch. Now, after burnout, this is where things have iterated, right? So historically, after burnout, we kind of knew where the missile was going because it was ballistic. It was just a rock with a warhead falling back to Earth. Now, with the additional capabilities of maneuverability or hypersonics or the glide vehicles as they come through the atmosphere and maneuver, our propagation mathematics no longer can predict where that missile is going. And therefore, you need to layer in a active tracking component that enables our defense systems to know, I think as Chris mentioned, to provide a fire control solution to our interceptors and defense systems. And so that you heard me say after boost. So that means there's no more hot, easily detectable fire coming out of the back of the missile. So now you need different look angles and the same family of sensors, but different physics. Perhaps I'll let Dr. Swanson add in the technical details there. But when you want to be able to continue to track that reentry vehicle or potentially missile as a cold body against the blackness of space, or you can just imagine where if you're much closer at a lower altitude, say in a proliferated LEO constellation, it's a lot easier to look at something that's only a couple hundred kilometers away from you or even closer than, say, 22 or 32,000 kilometers away from GEO. And so that the different look angle and the different sensor composition and the multiple sensors looking at one target allows a much higher chance for tracking, again, to enable defense.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing, I guess, to what Coach was saying is each layer has the ability to track over a certain amount of time based on the altitude. So the proliferated LEO has the ability potentially per what all the published stuff says between like 5-10 minutes per satellite because of the speed of the orbit around the Earth. The farther out you are, like GEO, it matches the rotation of the Earth's turning on its axis, so it looks like it's hovering overhead, whereas medium Earth orbit, MEO or LEO, are obviously flying at a lot faster rates relative to the Earth, at least from our perspective. So as a result of that, as you go higher up, it increases the time that you can track So having a layered approach would allow you to get initial warning from the GEO, hand off to the MEO, and then continually hand off as you go lower until you can have that real-time tracking to intercept.
Now, what the audience can't see is that Chris Stone is actually talking with his hands like a fighter pilot as he's talking. It's because it's basically all about angles, right, Chris? And I know Dr. Swanson here, as a tech expert, really can walk us through. Sir, what are the technical challenges a concept like this might face, and how does it stack up from a tech readiness level assessment?
Well, I think the technology is there, right? And I think that Chris and Coach have both done a really good job at describing the advantages of the multi-layered approach. And there are prototyping efforts underway right now. The Space Development Agency, Space Systems Command, and Missile Defense Agency all have prototyping efforts looking at all of these layers right now. But I think it's the right solution, and the technology's there. We've just got to get that capability fielded for the warfighter. I'd like to expand a little bit on my view of why I think this is the right approach, this multi-layered approach. And there's really three key principles there. There's resiliency that you gain through orbital diversity. There's the ability to tune the different designs at the different layers to optimize to a different portion of the missile warning, missile tracking requirement set, depending on the orbit that you're in. And it allows the enterprise to shift away from an architecture where you've got a small number of high value assets up at GEO and HEO, which is basically where we are right now, to a more proliferated constellation in lower orbits. And there are some advantages to that. But touching on the resiliency piece, adding these proliferated LEO and MEO layers to the current GEO and HEO missile warning baseline, the LEO layer has advantages that it's closest to Earth, and you can get the best sensitivity, the best performance out of sensors at that orbit from a sensitivity standpoint. But as was mentioned, they fly pretty fast. You've got a lot of handoffs between vehicles. It's also the closest layer to Earth, and it's the closest to the enemy's countermeasures, right? So LEO is a relatively dangerous place when it comes to the ability of the enemy to counteract our capabilities. But it does give you some advantages in being easy to get up there. You can launch more vehicles for cheaper into those lower orbits. So there are some advantages there to that LEO solution. MEO's further away than LEO. It's not, I would say, a completely safe orbit, but it's safer. It's relatively open territory compared to the crowded GEO belt where all the high value assets are today, aside from the HEO assets that we've got. And there's no standard MEO orbit or altitude, so you've got kind of a little bit more safety in just the open space there. There's a large open space that the adversary would have to cover if they want to attack our assets there. And then and GEO does have its advantages, though. Coach mentioned GEO is a great place for warning because it's persistent. You're hovering over a specific spot on the Earth, and it's that sort of unblinking eye that's always there, looking at that global coverage. But again, it's a pretty busy orbit. It's well understood. There's lots of assets there, and we can expect the adversary to be ready to attack assets in GEO if things go there. So the next part is the ability to tune these designs depending on which orbit you're in, and there's a wide array of requirements across the warning and tracking missions, and really it's one integrated end-to-end kill chain that we're talking about here, right? We talk about warning and tracking as if they're two different things, but it's really they're complementary. It's kind of a birth to death, detect a missile and take it out type of kill chain that we're trying to support with both of these missions. So the sensor that you're designing for the boost phase, the early phase warning, might look significantly different than a sensor that you designed for post-boost tracking. And Coach mentioned the physics, the different phenomenology. He's 100% right. The sensors might be looking, have some different features, be looking in different infrared bands, depending on what phase of flight these threats are in. So you can tune those sensors more optimally depending on what orbit you're in. But there is some overlap. You get kind of a belt and suspenders approach if you do get into a contested environment where you've got the different layers supporting each other and not just stovepiped into specific pieces of the mission that are given 100% to each layer. Then the other thing that is the advantage of this layered architecture is moving away just from putting all your eggs in this high valued asset basket and going to these proliferated constellations, right? As Coach mentioned, we've got world-class warning assets up on orbit right now that have a lot of capability, but there's a small number of them. They're very expensive. They're very long lead time to develop and launch. So losing one of them can create a significant capability gap, right? So having your capability spread throughout these additional orbits really gives you that resiliency, as I mentioned before, that resiliency through orbital diversity. But to get there, to be able to enable that capability in LEO and MEO, you need more vehicles, right? You need a lot more vehicles in LEO to provide the coverage that you need, that you would get at GEO. You need more vehicles in MEO than you would need at GEO. That gives you some more inherent resiliency to a loss of a single or a small group of vehicles, but it means you have to launch more, right? So that means there's a strategy for that. And there's a lot of developments that have come online in the last 5 to 10 years here that I think enable that. Miniaturized sensors. We need to field sensors that are less exquisite, that get the job done, right? That are more affordable. But power in numbers lets you still get the capability to the warfighter that you need with those less exquisite sensors. Leveraging commercial space practices, right? You look at the commercial constellations that are being launched, and production lines of these sensors and these vehicles and these launchers. Having ongoing rolling production lines where you're able to keep the production going, less stoppage on and off, allows you to react more quickly to adversary fielding new capabilities, to insert technology where you need to. So developing these cheaper, shorter life, but faster replenishment type vehicles, leveraging the commercial practices enabled by new entrants in space launch and new entrants in commercial space can really get you there. So there's a lot of advantages to this multi-layered approach, and I think the technology is there, and the DoD is certainly moving in that direction to field capability.
Yeah, and I'd also add one more thing that I'll mention. He mentioned both integration and strategy, and while the Space Force's SWAC, Space Warfighting Analysis Center, has been working on their own force design separate from the one that's proposed in the paper, I will mention that both the Space Development Agency, Missile Development Agency, and the Space Force's projects were all created as separate solutions to the same problem. And so they're working at getting an integrated strategy to figure out what to do in the future. But one of the main things that has to happen, as Dr. Swanson says, is all these different designs are great pieces of an overarching puzzle, and it'd be much better if, rather than picking one or two, that if we have a multi-layered approach and we integrate what's already out there and already being, tested, designed, and almost ready to be launched in some cases, is a way better approach than having just an exquisite place that can be targeted much easier.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And Dr. Swanson, we don't get a chance to talk to chief engineers very often, so I want to put you on the spot a little bit and dig a little further. How do you see each orbital basing concept complementing one another to achieve this real-time tracking and fire control solutions for missile defenders that are going to be deployed around the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I said in my first response, the different orbit regimes have advantages and disadvantages depending on what set of the end-to-end requirements that you're looking at, right? As we mentioned before, GEO's great for warning, right? It's that constant presence, global coverage. You don't need a whole lot of vehicles to get that coverage. You've got sensors that have enough sensitivity to see those bright plumes during the boosting phase of the missile launch. And that's what they were designed for. I think Coach mentioned DSP, the Defense Support Program that first launched 50 years ago. Its goal was that strategic deterrence. We got to make sure that we understand if something's been launched, where it was launched from, who launched it, and where it's going, right? But that was all dependent on these ballistic threats, right? So we still need that warning capability to provide that deterrent. We also need the capability because these new threats, these maneuverable hypersonic threats, are typically launched from the same types of missiles that launch the ballistic threat. So you still need to be able to see them and track them in that early phase. But when you get to that post-boost phase, things are a lot dimmer. Those GEO assets have more trouble tracking those assets in the post-boost phase with those different physics and different phenomenology that has to be tracked. So that's where, when you get into the missile tracking requirements, targets are dimmer, they're non-ballistic, so you can't depend on those ballistic physics to predict where the target's going to go. You need to make sure you're getting constant measurements, constant looks, and you've got challenging latency requirements. You've got to get that information to the end user, whether it's that passive warning to make sure we get the warfighter sufficient warning to react if they don't have defenses deployed, or the active tracking where you've got to get that information to the end game user to be able to launch an interceptor or take whatever other action needs to be taken to defend against that threat. And generally, with the dimmer targets, closer is better, all things being equal, right? You go down to MEO and down to LEO, you're closer to the target. You kind of take a hit in coverage. You have to have more handoffs, as was mentioned before, as you go down to the lower orbits. But you can see dimmer targets, and that's that post-boost phase. It's critical to be able to track those targets as they're maneuvering in that post-boost phase. So basically, that's where you get the different allocation of requirements per orbit to optimize it. But that said, MEO can do some warning, can do some tracking. LEO can do some warning as well. It can, like I said, the belt and suspenders approach. And the other piece that was mentioned before was fire control, and that's the most sensitive, like right before the end game type of requirement set. And that's where the LEO and in some cases MEO solutions, depending on which MEO altitude you're at, right? There's low MEO, medium MEO, and high MEO altitudes. Depending on where you field those MEO assets, you might be able to support some of the fire control requirements from that altitude as well.
Yeah, awesome. I really appreciate that. For Chris and Coach, it's obviously important to protect spacecraft against anti-satellite and counter-space weapon systems. So what are some of the threats that spacecraft face in each of these orbital regimes, and what can be done about such threats?
I could spend another podcast just on this alone. I think, as Dr. Swanson mentioned, there is a factor of proximity, right? So in low Earth orbit, you're just much closer to the Earth, and therefore the risk calculus that a constellation has to contend with can run the entire gamut, from jamming to lasing to potentially microwave weapons or in anti-satellite missiles. It's just easier to plink them when they're right above you. Now, as you move out to different orbits, you can, I think, and Dr. Swanson mentioned this as well, it's just there's the different distance is a protection all of its own in some cases. So if you're at 12,000 nautical miles or 25,000 nautical miles, there's just many orders of magnitude difference from that low Earth orbit regime. And therefore, it's just a different, it's going to be more purposeful. Any attacks against those types of systems will likely, if it's core orbital, for example, the Space Force and our partners invest a lot in space domain awareness to maintain, to keep folks from just sneaking up on us. But our adversaries are developing counter space capabilities that are core orbital. And so all of that drives, whether you have a mosaic, this multi-layered approach that has the ability, a force design that allows for the adversary to have to field different capabilities based on those different regimes, as well as the fact that the Space Force, as an independent service, this is my opinion, but you can see that the force going this way. The service is going to make use of the capabilities we have today. We're going to develop new tactics, techniques, procedures. We're going to use, even though it might be a fat, juicy target, as some of our senior leaders like to say, we're still going to do our best to defeat any adversary that attempts to negate these systems. And so as our capabilities grow with new fielded systems, my expectation is those systems will also have more resiliency built into the architecture, whether it's from just by proliferation or other mechanisms. And those mechanisms should allow for the Space Force operators that join now and after me to build a fairly robust capability. Again, just like the air domain, right? You see there is a evolution of air tactics to either gain or maintain air superiority or to survive if you're a high-value asset. And so those principles do apply now and will continue to apply in the space domain.
Yeah, and I'll also add, as I've mentioned before, if you look at the Chinese, for example, they have said multiple times that they are deploying what they call a multi-layered attack architecture. And so it only makes sense that if you're going up against an adversary that A, is building missile systems that are designed to negate the advantage and the ability for us to track these missile systems from a terrestrial standpoint, they're also looking at ways to negate those sensors from a more active approach by using all these different weapons that Dav mentioned earlier, which was including, jammers and missile systems. So keeping all that in mind, it's very important that we understand that because of the proliferated LEO being sort of the answer in a lot of people's minds, resiliency in numbers is not sufficient when you have an adversary that's building a deep magazine of kinetic interceptors and has a different view of how space is from a more of a big sky view, or maybe even, for example, ISR satellites, separate from missile warning, but both missile warning and ISR satellites, intelligence satellites, are viewed as battlefield prep, and we view them as more support functions. So it's not an if, it's a matter of when, and we always deal with a lot of these situations and operations day to day, so it's not like it's also not a future issue on the lower spectrum. We see a lot of this happening daily. So it's something that has to be accounted for in design.
Well, speaking of which, Dr. Swanson, anything for you to add on this from a design, engineering, or any other perspective?
The other speakers, I think, covered it pretty well. I would say, though, that one of the challenges here is you get into a shooting war here, and it becomes a war of attrition, right? And, in addition to having the capabilities and the tactics to react to threats, there's also the importance of predicting threats, right? And having those plans in place to be able to react quickly, whether it's predicted or not, to be able to react to a threat and have a book full of responses ready to go, and to make use of those countermeasures that are in place to protect our assets. So it's a challenging area. It is another part of the kind of keeping up with the Joneses. The adversary develops a new capability and we have to respond to it. But I'll just say that the enterprise is looking at this seriously and is taking action and putting plans in place to address it.
Yeah, I appreciate the pile on there. And as I'm absorbing this, I've got to put Chris on the spot and ask, if we've explored this and the approach is so good, why haven't we tested or deployed it before?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the answer is it's a combination of both policy and technology. So from a policy standpoint, as Coach mentioned earlier, in the post-Cold War period of 1991, after the Gulf War showed the positive advantages that come at the theater level with these formerly known as strategic missile warning assets from the nuclear war kind of prep stuff, and because of the end of the Soviet Union, and because China hadn't developed itself as a fully functional missile and space power yet, we really didn't see the need for a lot of counter space threat protection. So as a result, we looked more at longevity of system for cost savings rather than for maneuverability or durability in a shooting war context. Now, part of that also, as I mentioned, from the technology standpoint, Dr. Swanson mentioned, miniaturization of sensor technology, small sats, being able to do a lot of things that even just a few years ago, a lot of the experts didn't think was possible, that you had to build a huge, exquisite satellite to be able to have the type of sensor power, as well as just the ability to do its standard mission. But now you can do a lot of things with smaller satellites and multiple orbits that you couldn't do before. And also the cost of launch has dropped, so you can launch more of them for a lot less. And so because of that, of those restraints policy-wise, and because of the technology advancing, I think we're now at a good point where these ideas that have now become a lot more proliferated outside of just academia, but into the operator's mindset, I think now is a really good time to put this into play.
Well, Chris, isn't it true, though, that there are parts of the DoD that are pursuing various elements of this approach right now? So how and what, of what you're proposing, how is it different?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier a little bit, each of these departments within the DoD, SDA, Space Development Agency, Space Force, Missile Defense Agency, they all have their own their own answers to this problem of missile tracking and fire control. So the proliferated LEO of SDA, the HBTSS, which is hypersonic, and also a ballistic tracking satellite system, as well as the MEO system, which doesn't have a name yet, and then, of course, Next-Gen OPIR, which is the SBIRS replacement. All these folks, all these have been created in separate stovepipes as the answer to the problem. And now with SWAC, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, looking at their own force design that they put out a few months ago, they are starting to get after how to integrate some of these things and which ones are they going to keep and move forward with. And so what's different about this proposal that we put out is, in addition to having a multi-layered approach where you're combining all of the orbits, LEO, MEO, GEO, and polar, you also need to have something a little bit more than just resiliency. You need to add survivability, which means with all those threats we talked about across the counter space spectrum, you need decoys to where people don't know how many satellites are actually active satellites, so they could be wasting ordnance on fake ones, just like you would when an aircraft drops chaff to confuse a missile system coming after them. Also, the ability to maneuver with more advanced propulsion systems at GEO and MEO rather, because there's less satellites up there than you have for handoff down at the lower levels. You need to have the ability to maneuver out of the way, or to maybe even move into different orbital altitudes based on anything that needs to be backfilled after some hindrances from being shot at. So this is a lot different than what people have been talking about. But I think that people are starting to pick up the importance of that multi-layer offers.
Well, I want to open up this last question to anybody on the panel, and I'm going to flip a common question that we usually hear in DC. Normally people will ask, what will this cost? But let's look at it a different way. What's the price of inaction when it comes to these recommendations and pursuing a multi-orbit space-based missile warning and tracking system, given what we've seen from the adversaries, especially China and Russia?
Yes, I'll take a response to that, given my earlier discussion about how passionate I am about this. The cost will be immeasurable. As you have recently heard, General Raymond has identified this missile warning and tracking as one of the number one priorities for Space Force, primarily because you will see, if there is to be a conflict someday between the United States and adversaries like Russia and China, these systems will be how they attempt to kill Americans, our allies, and break our stuff, destroy our things. They don't have a U.S. Air Force, and so this is the only means that they have to project power, and therefore we have to have a capability to respond to their force projection. And just as we see in Ukraine, they are capable enough to lay waste to large areas. And so this is a natural evolution, as already discussed now, this third-generation multi-layer approach can help us ensure that we maintain that edge that we have shown effective over the past 50 years.
Yeah, I've got a comment as well. Another aspect here is attribution, right? And this has always been a big piece of the strategic missile warning mission is not only are you detecting that something's been launched, but you can tell who launched it, right? And towards where. As the adversary's starting to field these new generation of weapons, even if they're not using them against us, if they're using them against allies or against even, anyone in the world, the ability to detect from birth to death and maintain track custody of these threats as they fly out, lets the adversary know that we will know who's shooting these missiles and where they're going, right? Not having that ability to lay attribution towards these threats can allow a little bit more freedom for the adversary to do things like we're seeing in Ukraine, right? So it may make them take a step back if they know that we have the ability to see these things and track them all the way through birth to death. So I think that's also a very important aspect of us needing to field this capability.
Yeah, I actually was asked this question by a member of the press during the rollout a couple weeks ago. And while the scope of the study does not get into necessarily the price tag per se, I would say, as kind of alluded to by the other two folks, the amount of damage that these weapon systems can do, both the space-based ones trying to take out the sensors and the missiles that the sensors need to be designed to track, put the lives of our armed forces and our citizenry at risk right now. And into the future, as Coach mentioned, that these are those systems that people are going to be using against us and our allies in the future. And so The cost of inaction is our job as a national defense establishment is to protect and defend the people, our forces, and our interests. And if that really is the main priority, then I believe that it should be funded accordingly as such.
Well, I can't say thanks enough for everybody being here. It's such an incredible topic, and this is essentially the Space Force. It's almost like the Billy Mitchell moment, right? I mean, you guys are telling us how important this is, and we really need to make sure that everybody from the average American up to the highest elected officials are tracking all of it. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Lick. I really appreciate the chance to provide the 2 cents on a passion project for me. Obviously, the Space Force and ultimately Congress will decide what the funding will look like. But my hope is that it is a capable, whatever we do have will be the most capable we can provide, again, for that defense of our allies, and our partners. So thank you for the time.
And thanks for the invite to participate. This is a hugely important mission area, and I'm glad it's getting the attention it deserves. So thanks again.
And also thanks for having me. It's always good to be back and chat with you.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to our listeners for your continued support and for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you've heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you think we should explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and check 6.